The final echo of the judge's dismissal hung in the stifling courtroom air, but Barrister Femi Adebayo didn't move. He stood, sweating in his heavy legal wig, as the ceiling fans above battled the Lagos humidity, moving nothing but the dust. He looked at his clients, a widow from Makako and her children, their eyes empty after losing their fight against a land grabber with deep pockets. Another battle lost. Another hour of brilliance traded for a headache and a polite "God bless you." As Femi walked out, the noon sun of Oberland hit him like a physical blow. The street noise, the keek drivers honking for passengers, the sellers yelling "Buy your cold pure water here," became a disorienting, deafening roar. His worn leather briefcase, heavier than any cross he was meant to bear, felt like a joke. A decade of being the people's lawyer, a champion with empty pockets. He was tired of being the saint. He was tired of being the broke messiah. He pulled off his wig, his scalp burning, and stared at the red dust coating his dress shoes. He didn't just feel tired. He felt broken. He gripped the worn handle of his briefcase until his knuckles turned ashen, looking up at the harsh Nigerian sky and whispering, "Something has to change. This can't be my portion." The morning sun over the outskirts of Lagos did not rise. It bruised the sky, a deep, swollen purple that bled into a hazy orange. Before the first Danfo bus had even rattled its way toward the city center, Barrister Femi Adebayo was already on his feet. In his small, two-room apartment, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and cheap detergent. Femi stood before a mirror that had seen better decades, adjusting a tie that was beginning to fray at the edges. His suit was a charcoal gray, a relic of his university days in London, now tailored so many times by the local roadside seamstress that the seams seemed to be holding on by sheer willpower. He was a man of precise movements, a legacy of his legal training, but lately, those movements were slowed by a gravity that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with his bank account. Femi stepped out into the street, his leather briefcase in hand. It was a heavy, rectangular beast, its handle worn smooth by 10 years of carrying the burdens of people who could only pay him in prayers and the occasional basket of yams. The neighborhood was a chaotic symphony of early morning survival. Smoke from firewood fires curled into the air as women prepared moin-moin for the day's trade. Children in mismatched uniforms ran past him, their laughter a sharp contrast to the weary lines etched into Femi's face. To the people of this district, he was not just a lawyer, he was the oracle. He was the man who understood the big grammar of the white-walled courts, the one who could stand before a judge and speak for the man whose land had been stolen by a local chief or the woman whose shop had been illegally demolished. As he walked, his route took him past a place that served as the heartbeat of the neighborhood, the Iron Sanctuary. The Iron Sanctuary was a sprawling, oil-soaked mechanic workshop. It was a graveyard of rusted Peugeots and gutted Volkswagens, but it was also a school of life. Under the shade of a massive, ancient mango tree, a dozen young apprentices, boys ranging from their early teens to their early 20s, toiled in the dirt. Their hands were permanently stained with grease, their faces smudged with the black soot of engine parts, but their spirits were as bright as the sparks flying from the welding torch in the corner. Femi never walked past without stopping. It was a ritual that had existed for years. "Good morning, my brothers," Femi called out, his voice resonant and warm, carrying the authority of a man who spent his days in the high court but the humility of a man who remembered his roots. The clanking of wrenches against metal stopped instantly. The boys looked up, their white teeth flashing against their oil-darkened skin. "Barrister, the law himself," one of them shouted, wiping his hands on a rag that was more grease than fabric. "Barrister, you are looking sharp today." "Another win in court," called another, a young man named Tunde who was currently elbow-deep in the belly of an old Mercedes. Femi chuckled, though the sound was a bit hollow. "The law is a slow grind, Tunde, but we move. How is the master's health today?" "He is well, Barrister. He is inside, complaining about the price of engine oil as usual," Tunde replied, stepping forward. Femi took a moment to look at them. These were the sons of the soil, hardworking, brilliant in their own right, yet overlooked by the system. He saw himself in them. He, too, was an apprentice of sorts, constantly trying to fix a broken legal system with tools that were never quite enough. "Listen to me, all of you," Femi said, his tone shifting to that of a mentor. "Study the engines, yes. Learn the craft. But do not let the oil get into your souls. Be honest. Be diligent. The world might see grease on your hands, but let them see gold in your character. Understand?" "Yes, Barrister," they chorused. Femi reached into his pocket. He didn't have much. The previous day's court appearance had only yielded enough for his own bus fare and a modest dinner, but he pulled out a handful of crumpled naira notes. It wasn't a fortune, just enough for them to buy a round of cold drinks or some extra meat with their lunch. For the afternoon, son, he said, handing the money to the eldest apprentice. Ah, barrister, you do too much. Every day you give. The boy protested, though his eyes shone with gratitude. It is nothing. To whom much is given, or in my case, to whom much is entrusted, much is expected. Go on, get back to work before your master comes out to find us chatting. With a final wave and a polite tip of his head, Femi continued his walk. He felt the eyes of the neighborhood on him, the respect, the expectation. But as he turned the corner and the workshop faded from view, his shoulders slumped. He was a man living a double life. In public, he was the pillar of strength, the benevolent advocate who gave even when he had nothing. In private, he was a man who stayed up late into the night by the light of a single kerosene lamp, calculating how many more weeks he could survive before his landlord lost patience. He walked toward the main road where the Danfo buses screeched to a halt. The dust from the road rose up, coating his polished shoes in a fine red film. He looked down at the shoes. The red dust was a persistent enemy. No matter how much he polished them, the earth always claimed them back. He reached the bus stop, standing among the laborious and the market women. A sleek, black Range Rover tinted with dark glass purred past, splashing a puddle of stagnant water onto the sidewalk. Femi stepped back just in time, but he felt the spray on his ankles. He watched the car disappear into the distance, heading toward the affluent parts of the city, Victoria Island and Ikoyi, where the roads were paved and the air was conditioned. For a moment, a flash of something uncharacteristic crossed his face, envy. It wasn't just about the car. It was about the ease. He thought of the wealthy lawyers he faced in court, men who arrived in motorcades, whose suits cost more than his annual rent, and who represented corporations that crushed the very people Femi tried to protect. They weren't smarter than him. They weren't more diligent. They simply knew how to play a different game. Femi boarded the crowded bus, squeezed between a woman carrying a basket of dried fish and a man sleeping with his head lolling onto Femi's shoulder. The heat inside the vehicle was oppressive, a thick blanket of human breath and exhaust fumes. How many more years? He wondered as the bus jolted forward. How many more morning rituals? He looked out the window as they passed the outskirts of the city, where the urban sprawl met the vast, undeveloped stretches of land. These lands were the source of endless litigation. They were the green gold of Nigeria. Families fought over them for generations. Developers hovered like vultures, and the law was often used as a weapon rather than a shield. Femi closed his eyes. He thought of the apprentices at the workshop. He thought of their loyalty. He had been their advocate, their friend, and their inspiration for years. He didn't know that on this particular day, the red dust of the street was about to be replaced by something far more substantial. He didn't know that his daily act of kindness, the simple stop at the workshop, had planted a seed in a young man named Leo, the quietest of the apprentices, who had been watching Femi's quiet struggle with more insight than Femi realized. As the bus crawled through the Lagos traffic, the temporal shift of the morning began to settle. The cool of the dawn was gone, replaced by the unrelenting fire of the Nigerian afternoon. Femi adjusted his briefcase on his lap. He felt the weight of the files inside. Cases of eviction, cases of wrongful termination, cases of petty theft. He was the champion of the poor, but as he looked at his reflected image in the grime-streaked bus window, he saw a man who was becoming a ghost. He was losing his own shape in the service of others. The bus stopped near the High Court. Femi stepped out, straightened his jacket, and wiped the red dust from his shoes with a handkerchief he kept for that purpose. He took a deep breath, composed his face into a mask of professional confidence, and walked toward the pillars of the courthouse. He was ready for the battle, but for the first time in his life, he found himself wishing for a different kind of victory. He wanted to be able to do more than just survive. He wanted to be more than a man who gave away his last naira for a round of drinks. He didn't know that the superfluous was waiting for him. He didn't know that the universe was about to offer him a deal that would test every moral fiber he had spent a lifetime weaving. The morning ended, the sun reached its zenith, and the cycle of his old life began its final, unseen revolution. The next morning, when he would stop at the workshop, the greeting would be the same, but the words spoken in the shadows of the mango tree would change the trajectory of his soul forever. The Harmattan haze had begun to settle over the city, casting a ghostly, chalky veil over the morning sun. It was that peculiar season in Nigeria where the air is dry enough to crack lips and the wind carries the fine, intrusive sand of the Sahara. Barrister Femi Adebayo walked his usual route, his breath visible in the unusually cool air. His throat felt like he had swallowed a handful of needles, a common tax paid to the season, but his stride remained rhythmic. As he approached the iron sanctuary, the familiar scent of burnt rubber and old diesel met him. But today, the atmosphere was different. The usual boisterous clanging was muted. The apprentices were huddled near the back of the workshop, away from the prying eyes of the street. Femi stopped, leaning his briefcase against a stack of discarded tires. "Good morning, my people," he called out, his voice slightly raspy. "Is the sun too shy to wake you today? Why is the sanctuary so quiet?" The boys looked up, but instead of the usual chorus of Barrister, they exchanged glances. Finally, Leo, the quietest and perhaps the most observant of the lot, stepped forward. Leo was a young man of few words, his eyes always darting with a sharp, mechanical intelligence. He wasn't just good at fixing engines, he was good at reading people. For years, he had watched Femi, observed the thinning fabric of his trousers, the way he would subtly wince when counting out the small change he gave them, and the dignity he maintained despite it all. "Barrister," Leo said, his voice low, pitched beneath the rumble of a passing truck. "Can we speak? In the shade, away from the road." Femi felt a flicker of concern. "Is something wrong, Leo? Has the landlord come for the workshop? Or is it the task force again?" "No, sir," Leo replied, gesturing toward the massive, gnarly roots of the ancient mango tree at the back of the lot. "It is about a different kind of burden. A family matter." Femi followed him. The shade of the mango tree was a sanctuary within a sanctuary. Here, the red dust didn't settle as thickly. Leo leaned against the trunk, his grease-stained overalls stark against the grey bark. "Barrister, you know my people come from the edge of the city, where the new highway is being carved," Leo began, his eyes fixed on his boots. "My family, we sit on a vast stretch of land. Acres that my grandfather cleared before the British even knew how to spell Lagos. But the elders, Barrister, they are tired. They are old men who want peace before they meet their ancestors. They are being harassed by speculators, by area boys, and by government vultures who smell their weakness." Femi nodded slowly. He knew this story too well. It was the classic Nigerian tragedy, ancestral wealth being eroded by the friction of modern greed. "What do they want to do, Leo? Sell?" "They have decided," Leo said, finally looking up. His gaze was intense. "They want to let it go. All of it. But they are afraid of the sharks. They want an agent of the law, someone who knows the big grammar, someone who can sign the papers so the government won't come back to haunt them later. But they are simple men, Barrister. They have fixed a price. A small price, just enough to build a few modest houses in the village and retire in comfort." Femi sighed. "If they have a price, why do they need me? Any junior advocate can draft a deed of assignment for a flat fee." Leo stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That is the thing, sir. They don't want a fee. They have set their total. Let's say, they want 50 million naira for the entire estate. To them, that is all the money in the world. But I have seen the maps, Barrister. I have seen the developers sniffing around with their foreign investors. That land, it is worth 5 times that. Maybe 10. Femi's heart gave a strange, erratic thump against his ribs. He felt the weight of his briefcase, the files of the poor, the unpaid bills, the crumbling ceiling of his office. "Leo, what are you saying?" "The family heads have had a meeting," Leo continued, his words coming faster now. "They said, find us a lawyer we can trust. A man of God who won't run away with our share. I told them about you. I told them you are the only one who doesn't look down on us. They said if you take the deal, you are free to sell the land for whatever price the market can scream. You give the family their fixed amount, every kobo of it, and the rest, the superfluous, it belongs to you. It is your commission. Your reward for years of being the only one who cared." Femi felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead despite the Harmattan chill. "Leo, that is unconventional. A lawyer's fee is usually a percentage, not the entire surplus. In our law, the law of the village, it is a thank you," Leo countered. "They want their peace, and they want you to have your breakthrough. They know you are struggling, Barrister. We all see it. The way you walk to save bus fare. The way you give us your last 100 naira for snacks. This is the land calling you." Femi turned away, looking out at the chaotic street. The temptation was a physical thing, like a sweet, heavy fruit hanging just out of reach. If he sold that land to a major developer, the surplus wouldn't just be a few thousand naira. It would be millions. Tens of millions. It would be the end of the red dust on his shoes. It would be the end of the leaking roof and the God bless you payments. "Is it legal?" he asked, his lawyer's mind automatically searching for the trap. "Everything will be documented," Leo assured him. "Power of attorney, deeds, everything. The family will sign. They just want their money and their peace. The rest is your business. Femi looked at his hands. They were trembling. He thought about the ethics he had preached to these very boys just 24 hours ago. Be honest. Be diligent. Was this dishonest? No. If the family was willing and informed, and they received exactly what they asked for, was it a crime for him to maximize the value? It was business. It was his expertise being put to use. But deep down, he knew this was a threshold. Once he stepped across it, he would no longer be the barrister of the people. He would be a player in the very game he had spent a decade loathing. Where is the land? Femi asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. Along the new corridor, Leo replied, a small smile playing on his lips. Where the billionaires are building their estates. Femi took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the dry, dusty air. He thought of his office, the stack of pro bono cases sitting on his desk, the widow, the wrongfully jailed youth, the old man fighting the corporation. If he had this money, couldn't he help them more? Couldn't he build a real clinic? A real school? He told himself these lies, the beautiful lies that men tell themselves when they are about to choose gold over grace. Tell the elders I will come, Femi said. When, barrister? This evening, before the sun sets. Bring the family heads to the workshop. We will look at the documents. Leo beamed, a look of genuine joy on his face. God will bless you, so. You are finally taking what you deserve. Deserve. The word echoed in Femi's mind as he picked up his briefcase. He didn't feel like a man who was getting what he deserved. He felt like a man who was selling his shadow. As he walked away from the workshop, he didn't head toward the bus stop. He walked toward the High Court, but his mind was already miles away, calculating hectares and square meters. The ritual was broken. He didn't wave to the other apprentices. He didn't notice the woman selling moin moin. He was already seeing a world where the red dust didn't exist. That afternoon, in the quiet of his cramped office, Femi didn't work on the widow's case. He pulled out a fresh sheet of legal parchment. He began to draft the most important contract of his life. A contract that would fulfill a family's humble wish and ignite a bonfire of wealth that would consume the man he used to be. The temporal shift was subtle but absolute. The before was ending. The after was waiting in the shadows of the evening, draped in the promise of millions. He looked at the clock on his wall, its rhythmic ticking sounding like the heartbeat of a giant. After a few more hours, he thought, everything changes. He sat in the dim light, the briefcase at his feet. The duct tape on the handle seemed to mock him. Never again, he whispered. I will never be small again. The deal was struck that night under the same mango tree, by the light of a flickering battery-powered lantern. The elders, with their weathered faces and shaky hands, signed the papers with thumbprints and crude signatures. They were happy. They laughed and toasted with a bottle of schnapps. To them, Femi was a savior. To Femi, the elders were the gatekeepers to a kingdom he had only ever seen from the outside. As he walked home that night, the Harmattan wind felt different. It didn't feel like a nuisance anymore. It felt like the breath of a new world. He was no longer just Barrister Femi Adebayo. He was the man who held the keys to the surplus. And as the darkness of the Nigerian night swallowed the city, the light of his old life finally went out. The transition did not happen with a thunderclap. It happened with the rhythmic, hypnotic scratching of a gold-plated fountain pen against premium bond paper. Barrister Femi Adebayo had spent his life navigating the slow grind of the magistrate courts, where justice moved like molasses. But in the world of high-stakes real estate, things moved with the terrifying speed of a bushfire in the dry season. In the months that followed the meeting under the mango tree, Femi ceased to be a ghost in the halls of justice. He became a titan in the boardrooms of Ikoyi. He had taken the family's modest mandate, the small price they had fixed, and treated it like a seed. He didn't just look for a buyer, he created a war. He leveraged his years of legal expertise to clear every lien, every ancestral dispute, and every government caveat that had bogged the land down for decades. He worked with a feverish intensity, often staying up until the small hours of the morning, fueled by black coffee and the intoxicating realization that for every million he added to the sale price, the family's share remained fixed, and his own grew like a rising tide. The suspense of the deal reached its peak during a closed-door meeting with the Zenith Development Group, a conglomerate known for building cities within cities. They wanted the land for a luxury golf estate. Femi sat across from their lead counsel, a man who once looked down on him in court, and didn't blink. He knew the land was the last green lung in that corridor. He held the power of attorney like a sword. When the final signature was dried, the amount was staggering. It wasn't just a surplus, it was a mountain of gold. Femi upheld his end of the bargain with a meticulous, almost religious devotion. He invited the family elders to a private bank vault. He watched as their eyes widened at the sight of more money than their entire lineage had seen in 3 generations. He paid them every kobo of the fixed price they had requested. To them, Femi was a god. They showered him with blessings, calling him the son of justice who had finally brought the family into the light. But as they left, clutching their bank drafts and weeping with joy, Femi remained in the vault, staring at the remainder, the superfluous. It was a sum that made his previous life look like a bad dream. Within a few short weeks, the red dust of the outskirts was scrubbed from his skin. He closed his small, crumbling office. He didn't tell the widow or the wrongfully accused youth that he was leaving. He simply stopped showing up. The files, the pleas for help, the desperate notes, remained in a cardboard box, gathering real dust while Femi moved into a world of marble and glass. The transformation was absolute. He traded his frayed charcoal suit for bespoke Italian wool. He traded the crowded Danfo buses for a metallic grey Mercedes-Benz that purred like a contented predator. But the most significant change was his address. Femi moved into the Grand Eko Heights, a 5-star hotel that rose above the Lagos lagoon like a monument to excess. He didn't just book a room. He took a long-term lease on a corner suite that offered a panoramic view of the Atlantic Ocean. As the moons began to cycle, Femi's life became a sequence of curated luxuries. He woke up to the smell of freshly roasted Highland coffee served by a waiter who knew his name but not his history. He spent his afternoons at the hotel bar, sipping aged whiskey and watching the sunset. He was no longer the man who gave away his last 100 naira for snacks. He was a multimillionaire, a man whose presence in the lobby caused the staff to stand a little straighter. The suspense shifted from his finances to his soul. The neighborhood lawyer had vanished. In his place was a man who lived in a gilded cage. He felt a strange, lingering tension, a sense that he was waiting for something, or perhaps hiding from something. The silence of the hotel suite was deafening compared to the clanging of the iron sanctuary. One evening, while the city below was choked in its usual twilight traffic, Femi stood on his balcony. He looked toward the horizon, where the red dust of the mainland met the smog of the city. He looked down at his shoes. They were made of the finest calfskin, polished to a mirror shine. There wasn't a speck of dust on them. He was rich. He was successful. He had made it. But as he poured another glass of whiskey, he realized he hadn't spoken a word of law in 6 months. He hadn't defended a soul. He was a man with a massive surplus, but he was becoming increasingly empty. The deal had made him a millionaire, but it had also turned him into a permanent guest in a world where nothing belonged to him. The hotel room was beautiful, but it was not a home. The staff were polite, but they were not friends. The superfluous had given him everything he ever wanted, but it had also taken away the one thing he didn't know he needed, a purpose. He lived in the 5-star heights, a king of a velvet kingdom, waiting for a reason to descend back into the world he had left behind. He was a man in limbo, caught between the wealth that had saved him and the vacuum it had created. The first year passed. Then the second. Femi Adebayo, the advocate of the poor, was dead. Julian, as he now insisted the hotel staff call him, preferring a more international name, was born. But even in the finest silk sheets, he found himself dreaming of the smell of diesel and the sound of laughter beneath a mango tree. The suspense was no longer about the money. It was about how long a man could live in a hotel before he forgot who he was supposed to be. The seasons bled into one another with a seamless, artificial grace inside the climate-controlled halls of the Grand Eko Heights. For Femi, now primarily known to the hotel concierge as Mr. Adebayo of the penthouse, time had lost its jagged edges. In his old life, time was measured by the ticking of a courthouse clock or the urgent rhythm of a client's heartbeat. Now, time was merely the interval between the morning buffet and the evening cocktail hour. 5 years had drifted by since the day he walked away from the red dust. Living in a 5-star hotel is a dream for those who visit, but for Femi, it had become a luxurious purgatory. His suite was a masterpiece of granite, silk, and glass. Every morning, a silent maid replaced his towels with fluffed, white clouds of Egyptian cotton. Every evening, the turn-down service left a single dark chocolate on his pillow. He had reached the summit of the mountain he had been climbing his entire life, only to find that the air at the top was thin and lonely. The suspense of his life had flattened into a dull, gold-plated ache. He had become a ghost in a tuxedo. He frequented the hotel's jazz lounge, sitting in the same velvet armchair, watching the elite of Lagos, politicians, oil magnates, and celebrities, trade secrets over flutes of champagne. He was one of them now, yet he was an outsider. They spoke of diversifying portfolios and offshore holdings, while Femi's mind would often drift, unbidden, to the smell of roasted corn on a rainy afternoon or the sound of Tunde laughing as he wrestled with a stubborn alternator. He had tried to fill the void with things. He owned watches that cost more than the Iron Sanctuary's entire inventory. He had a closet full of suits that he rarely wore to anywhere but the hotel dining room. But the more he acquired, the less he felt he possessed. He was a man who owned everything but belonged nowhere. The hotel was a world of permanent transience. People came and went, their lives touching his only in the elevator or the gym. No one asked about his childhood. No one knew about the widow he had failed to call. To the hotel staff, he was a VIP, a source of generous tips, a fixture of the lobby. He was no longer a man, he was a revenue stream. As the midpoint of the 5th year approached, a peculiar restlessness began to gnaw at him. He found himself standing on his balcony for hours, looking out at the sprawling chaos of Lagos. From the 20th floor, the city looked like a toy set. The poverty was invisible from this height. The struggle was just a blur of lights. He realized with a jolt of terror that he had become detached from the very soil that had formed him. He was a Nigerian man living in a space that could have been in London, Dubai, or New York. He had traded his heritage for a universal luxury that had no soul. The suspense intensified when he looked into the mirror one morning. He saw a man who looked younger than his years because of the lack of stress, but his eyes looked ancient. They were the eyes of a man who was waiting for a bell to ring, for a fire to start, for something to remind him that he was still alive. Then came the evening that broke the cycle. It was a Tuesday, though in the hotel, every day felt like a Saturday. The lobby was hosting a high-end art gala. Femi, bored with his own company, descended to the mezzanine. He wandered through the crowd of perfumed socialites until he found himself standing before a painting that stopped his breath. It was a simple canvas, a study of a hand, covered in grease, holding a small, silver wrench. It was titled The Apprentice's Prayer. It reminds you of something, doesn't it? The voice was like a cool breeze in a room that had grown too hot. Femi turned to see a woman standing beside him. She wasn't dressed in the loud, flamboyant lace of the other guests. She wore a simple, structured dress of deep indigo Adia fabric, her hair cropped short and natural. Her eyes were not on the painting, but on him. "It reminds me of a life I used to know," Femi admitted, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. He hadn't spoken honestly to anyone in years. "I am Abizola," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, real. "I'm the curator of this gallery. And you are the man who has lived in Suite 902 for 5 years without ever checking out." Femi felt a flush of embarrassment. "Is it that obvious?" "In a hotel, everyone is a traveler," Abizola said softly. "But you look like someone who is hiding. Or perhaps someone who has forgotten where he parked his car." They laughed, and for the first time in half a decade, the sound felt genuine. Over the following weeks, the casual encounter turned into a series of long conversations. Abizola was unlike anyone Femi had met in his gilded cage. She was a woman of the earth, an architect by training who spent her weekends working on social housing projects in the very slums Femi had fled. She didn't care about his superfluous millions. When he tried to impress her with the vintage of the wine he ordered, she would ask him about the cases he used to fight. When he showed her his view of the ocean, she would point toward the mainland and ask, "Who is speaking for them now, Femi?" The suspense of their growing relationship was built on a foundation of uncomfortable truths. Abizola was a mirror. In her presence, Femi's 5-star life began to look like what it truly was, an expensive distraction. "You are a brilliant man, Femi," she told him one night as they sat on the hotel's terrace, the humid air thick with the scent of jasmine. "But you are living in a waiting room. You have all this wealth, all this superfluous harvest, and yet you are renting your bed. You have built nothing that will outlast your bank account." Femi looked at the white tablecloth, the silver cutlery, the polished glass. "I wanted to be safe, Abizola. I was tired of the dust." "The dust is where things grow," she replied. "Nothing grows on marble." The realization hit him with the force of a gavel. He had spent 5 years avoiding the red dust, only to realize that by doing so, he had stopped growing. He was a multimillionaire, but he was homeless. He was a lawyer, but he was lawless. The suspense reached its breaking point when, under the glow of a full Nigerian moon, Femi realized he couldn't spend another night as a guest. He looked at Abizola, this woman who represented a bridge back to his own soul, and he knew what he had to do. But he also knew she wouldn't accept a man who was still hiding in a hotel. The gilded stagnation was over. The after was about to become the now. But before he could claim a future with Abizola, he had to prove he was willing to put his feet back on the ground, the real ground, red dust and all. He had to decide if he was ready to trade his 5-star suite for a foundation of his own making. As the Harmattan winds of the 6th year began to bite, The air in the penthouse of the Grand Eko Heights felt thinner than ever. Femi stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the sunset dip below the Atlantic. For 5 years, he had been a man of the air, suspended above the reality of the streets, cushioned by the soft carpets of the hotel. But tonight, the luxury felt like a weight. He had spent the afternoon with Abisola at a construction site on the mainland. It wasn't a luxury estate. It was a community library she was designing for a neighborhood not unlike the one he had grown up in. He had watched her move among the workers, her boots caked in the very red dust he had spent a fortune to avoid. She was vibrant, connected, and rooted. When he had returned to the hotel, the silence of his suite felt like a mockery. He knew he was in love. He knew he wanted Abisola to be the one to share his life. But he also knew that Abisola was not a woman who could be bought with a VIP status. She was a woman who valued the strength of the pillars, not the shine of the polish. In the quiet hours before dawn, Femi made his decision. He went to the hotel's business center and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, not the hotel's letterhead, but plain, heavy parchment. He didn't write a legal brief. He wrote a proposal. The following evening, he invited Abisola to the hotel's private rooftop garden. The city lights of Lagos twinkled like a fallen galaxy below them. He had arranged a table with the finest delicacies the hotel could offer, but as they sat down, he felt a profound sense of theater. It was a stage he no longer wanted to perform on. Abisola, he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. I have spent 5 years in this building. I came here because I was tired of being poor. I was tired of the struggle. I thought this hotel was the destination. I thought being sir to the concierge was the same as being a man of stature. Abisola watched him, her dark eyes reflecting the candlelight. She remained silent, letting him navigate his own confession. But meeting you, Femi continued, made me realize that I haven't been living. I've been waiting. I've been a passenger in my own life. I have millions in the bank, the superfluous from a deal that saved my bank account but nearly cost me my soul. And I don't want to spend another night in a place where I have to call the front desk to change a light bulb. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. Inside was a ring, a simple, elegant band of Nigerian gold, unadorned by the flashy diamonds he would have chosen a year ago. Abisola, I want you to be my wife. I want us to build a life together. The silence that followed was longer than any courtroom pause Femi had ever endured. The tension was a physical cord stretched between them. Abisola looked at the ring, then up at him. She didn't smile, but her gaze was not unkind. It was the look of an architect assessing a site for its structural integrity. Femi, she said softly, you are asking me to join you in a dream. But look around us. We are in a hotel. This isn't yours. This table is rented. This view is rented. Even the air we are breathing is filtered by a machine owned by a corporation. She leaned forward, her indigo attired dress rustling. I love the man who stops to talk to the mechanics. I love the man who cares about the widow's land. But I cannot marry a guest. I will not be a Mrs. Adebayo who lives in room 902. The suspense peaked as she stood up. She didn't take the ring. My answer will be yes, Femi. But only on one condition. You must leave this place. Not to another hotel, and not to a rented villa in Ikoyi. You must take that superfluous wealth and build your own house. A home with deep foundations. A place where the dust of the street is welcome because it belongs to the land you own. Build a house that has room for more than just us. A place where you can be the barrister again, not just a millionaire. Femi felt a jolt of shock, followed by a profound, cooling clarity. She wasn't rejecting him. She was demanding his resurrection. You want me to build, he whispered. I want you to plant, she corrected. Build a home. Establish your own soil. Show me that you are ready to be a man of the earth again. When the roof is on and the gates are open, ask me again. And on that day, my answer will be yes. She kissed him lightly on the cheek, a promise of what could be, and walked away, leaving him alone on the rooftop. During the weeks that followed, the hotel staff noticed a change in Mr. Adebayo. He stopped wearing his Italian suits to breakfast. He was seen in the lobby with rolls of blueprints and soil samples. He spent hours on the phone, not with stockbrokers, but with contractors, surveyors, and the elders from the family whose land he had sold years ago. He didn't just buy a plot of land. He bought a piece of the very corridor he had helped develop. But he didn't buy it for speculation. He bought it to stay. The suspense of his 5-star life began to dissolve as he initiated the great checkout. He began giving away the expensive things he had accumulated. The watches went to the apprentices at the Iron Sanctuary, whom he had visited for the first time in years. Much to their shock and joy, the designer furniture was donated to local schools. He was stripping himself back to the foundation. As the rainy season returned, Femi stood on a muddy plot of land on the edge of the city. The rain lashed against his face, and for the first time in 5 years, he didn't care about his shoes. He stood with a shovel in his hand, Abisola by his side, as the first trench for the foundation was dug. The hotel was behind him. The guest was dead. The builder was born. He realized that the superfluous was finally being used for its true purpose, not to buy a life of ease, but to build a life of substance. The step was taken. The commitment was made. Now, the challenge was to see if a man who had lived in the clouds could truly learn to live on the ground again. He looked at the red mud clinging to his boots and smiled. It was the most beautiful thing he had seen in years. As the cycles of the moon turned once more, the skyline of the district was no longer dominated solely by the skeletal frames of foreign-owned skyscrapers. Amidst the rising concrete of the new Lagos, a different kind of structure was taking shape. It was not a sprawling mansion designed to intimidate, nor was it a cold, glass-fronted box. It was a house built of warm, red laterite bricks and wide, welcoming verandas, a home designed to breathe with the rhythm of the land. Barrister Femi Adebayo stood in the center of what would soon be his living room. The smell of fresh sawdust and drying plaster was far sweeter to him than the expensive French perfumes of the hotel lobby. He was thinner now, his skin bronzed by the sun and his hands no longer perfectly manicured. There were callus on his palms from months of supervising every brick laid and every pipe fitted. He had traded the superfluous luxury of the penthouse for the essential labor of the foundation. By the time the final roof tiles were being laid, the neighborhood had begun to take notice. The news had spread like wildfire through the market stalls and the mechanic shops. The oracle has returned. Femi didn't just build a house for himself and Abisola. On the ground floor, facing the street with large, accessible windows, he had built a wing with a separate entrance. Over the door, a simple wooden sign was hung, the Adebayo Legal Clinic and Community Center. He had used the remainder of his millions to endow a trust that would ensure the poor of the district would never again have to face the big grammar of the courts alone. The day of the move was not marked by a fleet of moving trucks. Femi arrived with only a few trunks of clothes and his old, duct-taped briefcase, the one item he had refused to throw away. Abisola arrived as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in the vibrant, dusty pinks of a true Nigerian evening. She walked through the open gates, her eyes taking in the garden he had planted, the sturdy pillars, and the light spilling out from the legal clinic. She saw the young apprentices from the iron sanctuary sitting on the low wall of the veranda, sharing a laugh and a drink, feeling as welcome as if it were their own workshop. Femi met her on the front steps. He didn't look like a millionaire. He looked like a man who had finally found his center of gravity. "The house is finished, Abisola," Femi said, his voice thick with a quiet, hard-earned pride. "The foundation goes 6 feet into the earth. The roof is made to withstand the heaviest rains. And the doors have no locks for those who come in search of justice." He took her hand and led her to the center of the veranda. The red dust of the street blew in on a light breeze, settling on the tiled floor. Femi didn't reach for a handkerchief to wipe it away. He looked at the dust and then at Abisola. "I am no longer a guest," he whispered. "I am home." Abisola looked at him, her eyes shining with the realization that the man she loved had finally outgrown the shadow of his wealth. She reached out and touched the brickwork, feeling the warmth of the sun still trapped in the clay. "Then my answer is yes, Femi," she said. 1,000 times, yes. They were married under the massive mango tree at the Iron Sanctuary, with the apprentices as his groomsmen and the widow he had once defended sitting in the front row, wearing her finest lace. The celebration lasted until the stars crowded the sky, a riot of drumming, dancing, and the shared joy of a community that had reclaimed its champion. In the years that followed, Femi and Abisola lived a life that was neither poor nor superficial. They lived a life of enough. Femi returned to the courts, but he did so with a new power. He was no longer the desperate lawyer fighting for crumbs. He was the lion of the district, backed by a foundation that could not be shaken. He never returned to the 5-star hotel. Sometimes, when he drove past it on his way to a high-stakes hearing, he would look up at the glass towers and smile. He didn't envy the people behind the tinted windows. He knew the secret they hadn't learned yet, that a man is only as tall as the ground he stands on, and wealth is only truly superfluous when it is given back to the soil from which it grew. Femi Adebayo, the barrister of the red dust, walked into his home every evening, kicked off his shoes, and felt the cool, solid earth beneath his feet. He was a multimillionaire, a husband, and a protector. But above all, he was a man who had finally checked out of the hotel and checked back into his own life. And they lived, not in a gilded dream, but in a beautiful, dusty, and vibrant reality.